Reality's Veil. A Time Traveler's Odyssey. By Elton Gar. Clay Watts walked through the glowing doorway, out of one of the most secret facilities in his world, into an almost entirely empty warehouse 6 years ago in an alternate, but nearly identical reality. It was always strange to step out of the enormous room filled with computers and generators into the identical room, but empty. Perhaps the reason Clay had been picked for this job was because he didn't really care about any of that. He just did his job. It was raining as he stepped outside. He didn't know if it had rained 6 years ago in his own reality, but it felt right. His stomach growled, and he took out a large piece of jerky. A fluke of the machine was that what could be sent to other realities was very limited. It was the same reason that everything he wore was cotton and wool. He made his way to a pawn shop where he sold the 10 pearls he had brought for $100 each. It was absurdly low, but the pawn shop owner probably assumed they were stolen, so it kept him quiet. From there, he found his target. Maggie Mae Smith was, so far as they knew, the first victim of a man who would kill 9 women in the next 6 years. She looked younger than she did in her picture. Young enough that Clay wondered why the bartender allowed her to sit in the corner drinking coffee. But from what he knew, it was a kindness because she didn't have anywhere else to go. He had memorized much of her story, and he knew that a better person might intervene. A small shove in the right direction could keep her alive. But that wouldn't stop the killer in this universe or his own. He'd just find someone else who was helpless, and Clay would have no way to find out who he was. So he sat alone in the bar, sipping on his own coffee, eating bar nuts, and ignoring the young woman. About an hour after she left, Clay did as well. His plan was simple. He'd watch a young woman be killed, and then enjoy the next few days until he was returned to his own world, where he would describe the killer. Any other information he got about the serial killer would, of course, be a bonus. But it was more important to be safe, because if he didn't get home, none of this would mean anything. Outside of the bar, he saw the girl sitting on a bench. He ignored her as well as he could. But every time he saw her, it was harder to think of her as nothing but a means to an end. He hoped she wouldn't join his nightmares. But he knew she would. Because on every trip, he had watched someone be horribly murdered and done nothing, and they had all joined the others in the nightmare. The worst was how slow it was. These weren't people who killed out of anger or hate. That would be fast. These were people who enjoyed killing and wanted that enjoyment to last. Several hours and a half a pack of cigarettes later, Maggie was approached by a white man with a beard and a baseball hat. Clay knew that was the killer. He looked nervous, helping to confirm this was his first time, and yet he also looked like a predator approaching his prey. He said something to her, and as he did, he lifted his head enough for Clay to get a better look at him. And he recognized him. Not as a killer or from one of the suspect pictures. That was James Bennett, one of the lead scientists of the project, and one of the few people who really understood how the science of the time machine worked. But that made no sense. Why would he have allowed Clay to come here if he knew Clay would discover he was a murderer? He watched for a moment, hoping that it was just a coincidence. That James wasn't the killer, he was just someone who had talked to a homeless girl. That question disrupted his simple plan, and as the scientist began to lead the girl away, Clay stood and followed. James didn't take her far. It seemed like he had this planned out carefully as they went into a building only a quarter of a block away. It was the type of cheap apartment where people kept to themselves and didn't ask questions. Clay stepped over a man that was sitting in the hallway, a needle laying on the floor next to him. At least he knew why they hadn't found anyone willing to talk to the police. The scientist unlocked the door to the apartment and guided Maggie in. As she was out of sight, he turned and looked directly at Clay. The look was one of recognition, but not one that suggested he recognized Clay personally. It was more like he knew what his job was. He moved through the door quickly, and Clay sped up even as he thought how stupid this was. Even with a gun, going in alone was foolhardy, but this had become more personal. He tried to turn the handle, expecting it to be locked, but the door opened. Maggie was sitting at the table, looking more surprised than terrified. And as Clay walked in, James sat a knife on the table between her and him.
So, the version of me in your world must have figured out the meaning too,
James said.
What are you talking about?
Infinity. You've come to create worlds just as I do, and this young woman will. Did they not explain to you that our choices are meaningless? They don't even really exist. And at the same time, everyone, no matter how small, creates a new world. We are powerless gods.
There had been some discussion of something when they told him how the machine worked. But he hadn't really cared. He just did his job.
I just know you're a murderer, and that means that James in my world is too.
Clay said. It wasn't quite that simple, but this man would know that.
We're all murderers. Every time you could have killed someone and didn't, you did in another reality. So none of our choices matter. And yet, we are going to create hundreds of worlds in the next few seconds. In some I will kill this woman, in just as many she'll kill me. In others you'll save her and kill me or not kill me or kill her.
So you're insane.
Clay said.
How can you look into infinity and not be changed? How can you truly understand that nothing matters and choose to act as if it does? I'm not choosing to kill people. I'm just the version of me on the path that chooses to kill. No more real or unreal than any of the others,
James said. While he was talking, his eyes moved away from the knife, and Maggie grabbed the weapon. That drew James's attention, and he said,
Good. Now create a world where a poor streetwalker kills a respected scientist and goes to jail for the rest of her life.
He then grinned in a way that suggested that he really didn't care. As James continued his discourse on the meaninglessness of choices, Clay felt a surge of frustration.
Enough of your philosophical ramblings. I was sent here to do a job, and I'm going to do the job. That's enough for me.
Maggie, sensing an opportunity, lunged forward with the knife. James, momentarily distracted by his own monologue, reacted too late. The razor-sharp blade cut a deep gash across James' chest. Blood bloomed through the expensive shirt, but as much as James pretended he didn't care, he had the advantage of a killer instinct, and Maggie didn't continue her attack. Clay had no such limitations. He grabbed the knife as it clattered to the floor. In it, he felt the moment of choice, and even though he had known this time, he could feel something. For a second, he saw realities skewed out before him. Choice was a truly tangible thing. Not the understanding that everyone had that their choices mattered, but he saw hundreds of choices, then thousands, and then all of them. So many that for a moment he lost himself.
You're getting it now. Using our machine changes you. It opens you to understanding all the possibilities. All you're doing is picking which of the already created roads you want to follow,
James said. His grin remained as Clay stabbed him. He didn't even react to the pain. It was more like the reaction you might have watching someone get stabbed. A reaction that Clay knew better than he wished he did. There was no time to think about it, and he said,
We have to get out of here.
We should call the police,
Maggie said.
No. He was right. Call the police, and they'll look for a reason to blame his death on the homeless girl and the man with no ID. And that's assuming they don't frame us to cover it up, because he works in a top-secret government program,
Clay said. While he did, he dug James' wallet and keys out of his pocket. Once he had those, he handed Maggie $800. He couldn't take her with him, and assuming they brought him back on schedule, he would only be here another 2 days. She barely had the words to thank him as she ran away. He hoped that the money would be enough to get her into a better situation. With that done, he went to the parking garage across the street. It wasn't huge, and after pushing the button on the keychain several times, he found James's car. Using it would be a great way to get thrown in jail for murder if he planned to be in this world long. But for now, it got Clay to this version of his laboratory quickly. The laboratory moved every few years. That way, they didn't have to send people back in time all that far to not appear in an alternate version of the lab. Going to this version of the laboratory was dangerous, because he hadn't joined the program yet. But he suspected that the reason his version of James had allowed him to come here was because he didn't expect him to return, though it might simply have been his belief that it didn't matter. According to his logic, no decision mattered since every decision happened. For Clay, it did matter, and he knocked on the nondescript metal door loudly. As he did, there was another flash of branching realities. In some he was shot, or the police were called. In others, no one answered, or they refused to admit anything until he was forced to give up. He pushed past all of those, focusing on the reality he wanted. He wasn't sure if the others still existed or he did anything, but a man opened the door. He didn't wear a uniform, but he wouldn't look any more like a soldier if he was wearing a uniform and standing in a line with 100 other soldiers.
I need to talk to the project manager,
Clay said.
James isn't working today.
The soldier said. That he used James's name at all was probably a breach, but that was also probably why he used the man's first name. It didn't tell you anything unless you already knew it. Clay didn't know James had ever been the project manager, but it made sense. He was one of the few people who truly understood the project.
He's not coming. He tried to murder a homeless girl. I was sent to stop him, and did,
Clay said. The soldier stepped back, and Clay put his hands out to his side to make it clear he was unarmed. The only thing he had was James's ID, which he tossed on the ground in front of the man.
Why come here?
Because he's running the project in my world, and I doubt he wants me to point the finger at him, since in that world he's killed 6 people.
The soldier nodded, then, stepping back, he drew a gun with one hand and pushed a button on the other. A few minutes later, Clay was standing in a room not all that dissimilar from the one that had sent him to this reality.
You understand that this will reverse the process that sent you here. If you didn't come here as you said, then it will send you to a world at random, and the odds of that world being one you can survive in is unlikely.
At least he understood why they had agreed to let him use their machine. If he was lying, it would kill him. But he only said,
"Send me home."
He felt the same strange pressure he had every other time, and a door appeared in front of him. But this one, rather than glowing, seemed to suck in light. And he felt an even stronger wave of concrete physical choice than he had before. This time, it was him stepping through the door. Either the man had lied to him, or he didn't understand. Either way, he saw millions of possible futures in which he stepped through the portal into instant or nearly instant death. This time, the choice felt more real and more connected. He didn't just step into the doorway, but he stepped into the reality he wanted, both by going through the doorway and by choosing the correct path out of an infinite number of wrong paths. And he found himself standing in an empty room that was the mirror of the room he had just left. There was no way to know if he had returned home or was just in another world. He wasn't sure if he cared. Not because nothing mattered in the face of infinity, but because it all mattered. But he also had a job to do. A job that would not only protect people in this world, but the project itself, because who knew how much damage James was doing. Everything seemed normal as he crossed town to his apartment, where he got his phone and wallet. That also seemed correct as he checked his contacts. He didn't call anyone. There was no one who would expect his call, because he kept a professional distance, even from his own family. It was the reason he had been picked for this job. With that, he got a cab to the laboratory he had been at a few days ago. The place had always been odd, because it was a top-secret laboratory in an industrial warehouse. No one questioned him as he walked in. That was one pitfall avoided, because he had some question of whether James would turn everyone against him. Instead, James was at one of the computer stations working. But as soon as he saw Cole, he stood up and said,
You can't be here.
The people in the other reality sent me back.
Clay said.
Then you killed me once already.
James said.
I'm not going to kill you this time. You're going to spend the rest of your life in prison.
That is one path ahead of us.
James said, and Clay thought he saw something from the outside that he had only seen from the inside before. This James, with years more practice than the other, had learned to choose the path he wanted just as Clay had. Clay saw the paths appearing around himself, They were shifting as he tried to pick. It seemed to stretch out into infinity. Both of them trying to force themselves and the other onto the path they wanted. And then Clay tried something else. Instead of forcing himself onto a path, he reached out and closed one path. All those connected to it were closed as well. James's eyes widened, but he said,
There are infinite paths, and you're trying to close them one at a time.
Clay knew that he was hopelessly outmatched by James's mind, but he didn't need to be smarter than him. He just needed to do his job. So, he ignored James and began to fold in possible future realities. With each set of worlds it became faster, and he felt James push against him. But James had gone too far down the path of believing that they were all real at the same time. Because of that, Cole could slowly break away every universe that James could use to escape consequence. And then it snapped into place. The reality had become fixed on what Cole wanted. A truly unusual world where James began to confess to everything he had done. While he was talking, the police arrived, but they didn't stop Cole as he walked out. He had done his job, and for now that was all he cared about.
Author's note. I love reading H.P. Lovecraft and cosmic horror in general, but the idea of something you could learn that would drive you insane was always hard for me to understand. I can understand being terrified by Cthulhu, but not by being driven insane simply by seeing it. And then I began to think about infinite parallel realities, and it became more clear to me how a concept could drive you insane. It's the combination of every choice existing, creating a situation where nothing you do can possibly matter, that begins to twist your mind. The advantage I have over James is that I can convince myself that it isn't real. What is real is my newsletter. You can sign up for it at sci-fi.com. Just look for the link that says free book. Or you can help keep me sane by joining my Patreon at patreon.com/Elton. Thank you. Elton Gar.